Something strange has been happening in Cleveland, and it has very little to do with what's actually happening on the field. The loudest tension around the Cleveland Browns right now isn't coming from the locker room, the coaching staff, or even the front office. It's coming from the media itself, and once you notice it, it's impossible to unsee. Over the past few weeks, one name has quietly become the center of a much bigger fight: Shedeur Sanders. Not because of some disastrous performance, not because of an off-field issue, but because of how people feel about talking about him. When a familiar media voice suggested Sanders should simply be cut, it wasn't just a hot take. It was a line-crossing moment that forced everyone listening to stop and ask why the conversation had gone that far that fast. Calling for a player to be cut isn't normal criticism. It's not skepticism. It's not debate, it's final. And that's exactly why the comment from Lloyd landed differently. Almost immediately, it triggered pushback not from fans on social media but from inside the same media space. Live on air, Ken Carman challenged the logic behind it, questioning whether this was still about football at all. What made this moment even more uncomfortable was the timing. With Kevin Stefanski no longer in charge, conversations that once felt cautious suddenly became blunt. Opinions hardened, old evaluations were revisited, and narratives that had been protected for months started cracking in public. This wasn't just disagreement, it was exposure. Exposure of how narratives form, how they're defended, and how quickly they can turn personal when pressure builds. And once that door opened, it raised a much bigger question that Cleveland can't ignore anymore: was this quarterback ever being evaluated fairly in the first place? It didn't sound like a hot take at first, it sounded definitive, and that's what made it hit so differently. When Lloyd openly suggested that Shedeur Sanders should be cut, the conversation around the Cleveland Browns instantly crossed into dangerous territory. This wasn't someone questioning development or pointing out flaws. This was a call to move on completely, as if the case was already closed. In NFL circles, words matter. Saying a quarterback is struggling is one thing, saying he's not ready is another, but calling for a player to be cut carries a much heavier implication. It suggests the player isn't just underperforming but actively hurting the team. And for many listeners, that conclusion didn't line up with what they were actually watching on Sundays. That disconnect is where the tension began. What made Lloyd's comment even more combustible was the context surrounding it. Sanders has one of the most vocal fan bases in football right now, and that visibility has created constant friction in media spaces. Every critique sparks backlash, every defense invites accusations of bias. Over time, frustration builds, and to some listeners, this moment felt less like a football evaluation and more like exhaustion boiling over. That's why the reaction was immediate and telling. Instead of being dismissed or debated quietly, the comment was challenged live. Ken Carman didn't sugarcoat his response. He didn't attack Lloyd personally, but he questioned the foundation of the argument itself. Why jump to the most extreme outcome? What evidence justified it? And was this really about the quarterback or about the noise surrounding him? Carman's pushback reframed the entire situation. He reminded listeners that wanting a player cut should only come from one place: proof that the player is a detriment to the team, not frustration, not online arguments, not media fatigue. Without that standard, the criticism stops being analysis and starts becoming reaction. And once that line was drawn publicly, the conversation could no longer hide behind just opinions. Because if a respected media figure could be challenged that directly on air, it raised a deeper, more uncomfortable question: how many other narratives were being shaped by emotion instead of evidence? What made this moment impossible to ignore wasn't the disagreement itself, it was where and how it happened. Media figures challenge each other all the time, but rarely do they do it this openly, this directly, and with this much conviction. When Ken Carman addressed the situation live on air, he didn't tiptoe around the issue. He went straight at the logic behind the statement, and that's what changed everything. Carman wasn't interested in defending a player blindly, and he made that clear. His argument wasn't emotional loyalty or fan allegiance. It was about standards. In his view, calling for a quarterback to be cut isn't just another opinion, it's an accusation. It implies the player is actively damaging the team, the locker room, or the future. And if you're going to say that publicly, you better have something stronger than frustration or internet noise to back it up. What stood out most was what Carman didn't do. He didn't hide behind vague language, he didn't walk it back later. He openly said he would repeat the same argument directly to Lloyd, privately or publicly, without changing a word. In an industry where criticism often stays indirect to preserve relationships, that level of accountability is rare, and listeners noticed. This wasn't about winning a media spat. Carman framed it as protecting the integrity of the conversation itself. He pointed out how easily debates around quarterbacks slip into something else: ego, fatigue, resentment toward fan reactions. When that happens, analysis stops being about football and starts becoming about everything surrounding it. And once that shift happens, the player becomes a symbol instead of a subject. By drawing that line live on air, Carmen forced the audience to reconsider the entire discussion. Suddenly, the focus wasn't on whether people liked Shedeur Sanders or not. It was about whether the criticism being thrown around was proportional, fair, or even grounded in what was happening on the field. That's why this pushback mattered. It exposed how easily strong language can normalize extreme conclusions. It reminded listeners that there's a difference between evaluating performance and reacting to chaos. And once that distinction was made publicly, it became impossible to pretend the conversation hadn't crossed into dangerous territory, because now everyone could hear it happening in real time. The volume didn't rise by accident, it rose because the environment changed. For most of the season, discussions around the Cleveland Browns quarterback situation followed a familiar pattern: cautious language, long-term framing, and carefully measured criticism. Nothing ever felt final. Every evaluation came with a disclaimer, every doubt was softened, and that restraint wasn't random. As long as Kevin Stefanski was in charge, questioning the quarterback direction meant questioning the head coach himself. In NFL media, that's a risky move. Coaches control access, information, and tone. Push too hard against their decisions and suddenly interviews dry up, conversations cool, and relationships strain. So instead of outright challenges, critiques were often redirected, framed as patience, development, or trusting the process. Once that power structure disappeared, the guardrails came off. Almost overnight, conversations shifted. Analysts revisited earlier opinions. Confidence replaced caution. Ideas that had previously lived in comment sections were now being spoken openly on air. That sudden change didn't go unnoticed by fans, especially those who had been raising similar questions for months without hearing them echoed by media voices. To them, it felt like permission had finally been granted. That's what made the timing so uncomfortable. The arguments themselves weren't new, the willingness to make them was. And when criticism arrives only after leadership changes, it raises a natural suspicion. Were these thoughts always there, just unsaid? This is where the Sanders debate escalated. Before, his evaluation lived in a gray area. He was discussed as temporary, provisional, or situational. After the coaching change, the language hardened. Opinions that once came with context suddenly came with conclusions. The same performances were now viewed through a sharper lens, and that shift gave the impression that the conversation wasn't evolving, it was being unlocked. For fans paying attention, the pattern felt familiar. Narratives are protected while power remains stable, then re-examined once that stability disappears. That doesn't automatically mean bad intentions, but it does complicate trust. If honest evaluation depends on timing rather than evidence, how objective was it to begin with? That's why this debate grew louder so fast. It wasn't just about a quarterback anymore. It was about credibility, about who felt comfortable saying what and when. And once listeners recognized that dynamic, the discussion around Shedeur Sanders stopped sounding like analysis and started sounding like something much bigger breaking loose. From the moment Shedeur Sanders entered the conversation in Cleveland, the framing around him felt different, and not in a subtle way. He wasn't introduced as a developing quarterback who needed time, reps, and patience. Instead, he was talked about like a temporary solution, almost an experiment, someone who had to prove he deserved every opportunity rather than grow into the role naturally. That framing mattered more than people realized. Every positive moment came with conditions attached. If he played well, it was framed as situational. If he struggled, it was treated as confirmation. Instead of being evaluated on a normal quarterback curve, Sanders was discussed as someone constantly auditioning, even after the job was already his. That set a tone early, one where progress wasn't celebrated, it was questioned. Mistakes carried extra weight. A missed read wasn't just a missed read, it became a referendum. A rough series wasn't just part of development, it fueled broader doubts. Meanwhile, similar issues from other quarterbacks were softened with language about scheme fit or growing pains. Over time, that imbalance shaped public perception. Fans didn't just react to performance, they reacted to how performance was presented. What made the situation even more complicated was how often Sanders was described in abstract terms rather than concrete football ones. Conversations drifted away from mechanics, footwork, and decision-making and leaned into labels: raw, unproven, not the long-term answer. Those phrases sound analytical, but they're vague. And vague language is powerful because it sticks, even when evidence starts pushing back. That's why many listeners felt like the conclusion was being written before the story fully unfolded. Instead of asking, "How is he progressing?" the question often sounded like, "How long until this ends?" When that becomes the default lens, everything the quarterback does is filtered through an expiration date. This framing also made it easier for frustration to build. When expectations are low but scrutiny is high, patience runs out quickly. And once patience disappears, discussion turns reactive. That's when criticism stops being about growth and starts being about escape routes. By the time the season reached its later stages, Sanders wasn't just playing against defenses, he was playing against a narrative that had already decided what he was supposed to be. And that's the most dangerous position a quarterback can be in. Because when perception hardens early, even improvement struggles to change minds. For much of the season, the conversation didn't just revolve around Shedeur Sanders. It revolved around who was supposedly safer than him. And that's where Dillon Gabriel entered the picture. Quietly at first, then more persistently, Gabriel was framed as the stabilizing alternative, the quarterback who wouldn't rock the boat, wouldn't invite chaos, and wouldn't ignite endless debate. The argument sounded reasonable on the surface. Gabriel was described as more consistent in practice, more prepared, more reliable within structure. Those words carried weight, especially in a media environment craving calm. Practice reports became the backbone of the case. Clean reps, smooth sessions, coaches liking what they saw behind closed doors. Over time, that narrative hardened into something resembling fact. But there was always a problem with it. Practice narratives don't face pressure. They don't collapse pockets, they don't test decision-making at full speed, and once real game situations entered the equation, the comparison started to strain. The pace was different, the windows were tighter, the margin for error disappeared. Suddenly, the things that were supposed to separate Gabriel didn't translate the way many had implied. What's important is how quietly that shift happened. There was no dramatic reversal, no public admission that the safe option argument had lost steam. It simply stopped being emphasized, mentions faded, talking points changed. And once Sanders began getting extended opportunities, the contrast became unavoidable. The discussion moved from who feels safer to who actually gives the team a chance. That's when the Gabriel narrative began to unravel, not through criticism, but through irrelevance. This wasn't an indictment of Gabriel as a player. It was a reflection of how narratives can outpace reality. For weeks, he was elevated not because of game-altering moments, but because he represented relief. Relief from scrutiny, relief from fan arguments, relief from controversy. And when a quarterback is promoted primarily as an escape from noise, the evaluation stops being about football. As Sanders showed flashes of command and competitiveness, the question quietly flipped. It was no longer why Sanders shouldn't play. It became why the alternative was ever framed as superior in the first place, and that question didn't have a comfortable answer. By the time the season progressed, the Dillon Gabriel as the safer option idea no longer carried the same confidence. It didn't collapse in a headline-grabbing moment, it dissolved. And that dissolution exposed something deeper. The comparison was never as solid as it sounded. It was built on comfort, not confirmation. At some point, the discussion around Shedeur Sanders quietly shifted, and that shift changed everything. Early on, most criticism at least pretended to live in football terms: reads, timing, pocket presence, development. But as the season wore on, those details started fading into the background. What replaced them wasn't sharper analysis, it was frustration. The tone changed first. Conversations became less about what Sanders was doing and more about how exhausting it felt to talk about him. Media members openly acknowledged the backlash they received online. Fan arguments became part of the storyline. Suddenly, the discourse itself, not the quarterback, was treated like the real problem. And that's when the evaluation stopped being clean. Once annoyance enters the equation, objectivity starts slipping. Instead of breaking down plays, discussions drifted toward reaction. Why is everything about him? Why are people so defensive? Why can't we criticize without chaos? Those questions may be understandable, but they aren't football questions. They're emotional ones. And when emotions drive analysis, conclusions tend to harden faster than evidence. This is the point Ken Carman subtly called out without naming names. He didn't accuse anyone of bias. He didn't claim agendas. He simply pointed out that the conversation no longer sounded rooted in on-field evaluation. That observation landed because listeners could feel it too. The criticism had started reacting to noise rather than performance. Once that happens, players stop being players, they become lightning rods. Every throw gets filtered through existing frustration. Good moments are minimized, bad moments are amplified, and worst of all, motives get questioned. Was the quarterback struggling, or was he just tired of being talked about? Was the criticism earned, or was it fueled by fatigue? Those lines blurred quickly. This is how narratives spiral, not because someone lies, but because irritation replaces curiosity. Instead of asking, "What is he improving at?" the conversation becomes, "Why are we still doing this?" And when that mindset takes hold, the easiest solution becomes the most extreme one: move on, cut ties, end the discussion. That's why this phase mattered so much. It revealed that the loudest criticism wasn't always coming from film study or performance metrics. It was coming from burnout. And burnout is dangerous in sports analysis because it pushes people toward conclusions that feel relieving, not necessarily accurate. Once fans realized that frustration was shaping the conversation as much as football, trust eroded. And when trust erodes, every opinion gets questioned, not for what it says, but why it's being said. Eventually, the debate ran into something it couldn't talk its way around anymore: results. When Shedeur Sanders finally received extended opportunities late in the season, the story everyone had been arguing about started to get messy. Not clean, not definitive, but complicated in a way that made earlier certainty uncomfortable. The Cleveland Browns didn't suddenly turn into a flawless offense. Sanders didn't morph into an MVP overnight, but the team stabilized, drives stayed alive, the offense looked functional under pressure. Most importantly, Cleveland competed and won meaningful games, including matchups that actually mattered inside the division. That alone disrupted the idea that Sanders was holding the team back. And that's where the narrative cracked. For months, the implication had been that moving on was the responsible option. That patience was being wasted, that waiting was costing the team something tangible. But once Sanders was allowed to play through mistakes instead of being evaluated through them, the team didn't collapse. In fact, it showed resilience. That didn't prove he was the long-term answer, but it absolutely challenged the idea that he was unfit to lead at all. What made this stretch so revealing was how difficult it became to discuss. Wins complicate takes, stability blurs extremes. Suddenly the language shifted again. The conversation wasn't about cutting him anymore. It became about sample size, sustainability, and future evaluation. Those are fair questions, but they weren't the questions being asked before. That inconsistency didn't go unnoticed by fans. Many started asking the uncomfortable what if. What if Sanders had been given that trust earlier? What if development had been allowed to happen through experience instead of delay? There's no definitive answer, but the fact that those questions gained traction says everything about how much the perception changed. This is where the story stopped being theoretical. Results don't erase earlier struggles, but they demand recalibration. And recalibration is hard when strong opinions have already been planted publicly. It forces media voices to either adjust or double down, neither of which is comfortable. By the end of the season, one thing was clear: the original certainty around Sanders no longer held the same weight. The story wasn't finished, but it was undeniably more complex than it had been presented early on. And once complexity enters the conversation, extreme conclusions start looking less like analysis and more like overreaction. By the time the season ended, the argument around Shedeur Sanders wasn't settled, but it was exposed. What once sounded like firm evaluation now looked far more fragile. Not because Sanders suddenly became something he wasn't, but because the confidence behind earlier conclusions no longer matched the evidence that followed. This is where the conversation in Cleveland gets uncomfortable. For months, fans were told patience had limits, that development was secondary to urgency, that the situation demanded decisive action. Yet when Sanders was finally allowed to play through pressure, mistakes, and real-game situations, the team didn't unravel. The Cleveland Browns remained competitive, the offense didn't sink, and the sky didn't fall. That alone forced a reassessment not just of the quarterback, but of how the discussion around him had been handled. The most revealing part wasn't the wins or losses, it was how quickly the tone shifted afterward. Strong declarations softened, certainty gave way to caveats. Suddenly, the same voices that once sounded definitive were urging caution, context, and more time. Those are reasonable positions, but their timing mattered, and fans noticed. That's why this debate feels bigger than one player. It exposed how media dynamics shape narratives, how access, fatigue, and timing influence what gets said and when, and how easily evaluation can drift away from football and toward comfort. When a conversation only becomes honest after leadership changes, it raises questions about transparency, not intent. To be clear, this isn't about declaring Sanders the future or dismissing criticism altogether. He still has flaws, he still has growth ahead. But the extreme framing, the rush toward finality, no longer holds up under scrutiny. And once that realization sets in, it becomes impossible to ignore how quickly opinion hardened before the full picture was visible. So the real question is whether Shedeur Sanders is the answer. It's whether he was ever given a fair process to arrive at one. Was evaluation driven by performance or by pressure, by film or by frustration, by evidence or by exhaustion? Because once those lines blur, everyone loses clarity. And if this season proved anything, it's that certainty arrived far earlier than truth ever did.